Welcome back to She Talks Green. Today's episode is all about one of the most critical elements in the fight against climate change: climate finance. Climate finance is essential for both climate action and climate justice. But what does it actually mean, and how does it affect our daily lives and our future? To help us understand the basics of climate finance, I am joined by Vibhuti Garg, Director South Asia at the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis. Vibhuti has been working on climate finance for nearly 2 decades, and today she is going to help us simplify this complicated topic for all of us. Vibhuti, welcome and thank you so much for joining in.
It's my pleasure to be speaking with you today on this very topical thing.
Vibhuti, we know that finding solutions to fight climate change and transitioning to cleaner energy comes at a huge cost. We need money for all of this. Help us understand what exactly is climate change, climate finance, and how much money India needs to fight climate change.
So, when we talk about the definition of climate finance, it is a multifaceted concept. While there is no single definition of climate finance, the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the way they have defined climate finance aims at reducing emissions and enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases and aims at reducing vulnerability of as well as maintaining and increasing the resilience of human and ecological systems to negative climate change impacts. So what is this definition covering is both, flow of funds to all activities, program, projects, which are intended to help address climate change for both mitigation as well as adaptation. And it covers across economic sectors anywhere in the world. It is also, I would say, very related and overlapping concept when we talk about green finance, sustainable finance, and low carbon finance. So basically, these are all, kind of covering the same thing. So when we are talking about with some bit of difference, because the way it encompasses various different things, because it won't only cover, say, for example, the sustainability can cover many more aspects, whether it's forestry, agriculture, and water conservation. When we talk about green, people would really think it more in terms of, deploying more renewable energy or energy efficiency. So those are some of the differences in different definitions, but they are more or less kind of overlapping with each other. So that's on the, the definition side of things. But when we look at what are the different sources to kind of help meet these needs for investment in different economic sectors or different activities that kind of addresses the negative impacts of climate change, it can be coming from both debt and equity. So there are various financing avenues available: private equity, sovereign wealth funds, global pension and infrastructure funds. Even the global fossil fuel utilities are investing now big in clean energy. Oil and gas majors are also kind of deploying a lot of capital. So there are multiple sources of avenues available to finance climate. On the debt side, we also have bond instruments which are well suited to funding renewable energy infrastructure projects, as they provide, long-term capital at competitive rates raised from a diverse set of investors. One of the types of bonds are, as we were talking about, green finance, sustainability linked finance. So green bonds, these are the most widely used bond instruments to fund renewable energy assets. In India, we do have REC Limited issuing, in 2024, they even issued yen-denominated green bonds aggregating to 61 billion Japanese yen. So it's being raised in different currencies. So some are being raised in US denominated currency, Now, REC we talked about has raised in Japanese yen. So that's one form of bond instrument. Then you also have sustainability linked bonds, which are being extensively used by global utilities. They've also started to make inroads in the Indian markets. We have few players like Adani, which raised about 300 million in the year 2021 through sustainability linked bonds, and several other corporates have also followed them. So this is on the bond side. Then there are, conventional loans from banks and financial institutions. And then there are also NBFCs, which are the non-banking financial corporations who are putting in big pots of money as well. And on the equity side, we have IPOs. So the companies are raising finance through initial public offering. Then there are other ways through which we talked about sovereign wealth funds. Then infrastructure investment trusts, what we call InvITs, are also something which are becoming very lucrative, especially for refinancing, because there is a pool of capital when if you transfer the existing. These are only applicable for operational projects. So once the projects become operational, you can transfer it to InvITs. And then there is a more capital pool available through conventional sources then. So these are becoming increasingly relevant in the Indian scenarios. Then you also have money coming from multilateral development banks, development financial institutions, and they are also, I would say, playing a very active role in kind of de-risking some of this capital because they are providing concessional loans and grants. The government is coming up with blended finance kind of instruments by pooling in different resources through public money from MDBs, and then which helps in unlocking a lot of private capital. So they are able to take more risk, whereas private capital usually comes in, when the projects are less riskier because they want assured return. So these kind of money, capital, or different instruments are really helping in bridging that financing gap. There is this whole thing on economic, social, and governance invested, which is the ESG investing, and the green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, which I talked about, are kind of subset to this ESG framework. So there is a lot of money available, and really, we really need to channelize some of these investment by putting in the right frameworks, the right disclosure frameworks, the taxonomy, defining what constitutes green. So these are the some of the avenues I would say for funding sources. We also have carbon markets now being developed. I think that's another way of funding these cleaner energy sources in the country. In India, it started through PAT scheme, wherein I would say the industries were incentivized to save energy and then trade beyond their permissible limit. But now we are having India is developing a formal kind of a carbon market. So I think that's a positive development, and that could really help in terms of again channelizing an important source of revenue for building in more clean energy ecosystem in the country.
So I think you explained that there are many channels available to bring this money into the market and use it for financing all the clean energy needs. But do we know how much money do we really need to finance the entire, energy transition or the clean energy solutions that we are working on?
If you talk about India's requirement, India's requirement are to the tune of 400 to 500 billion US dollars to achieve its NDC target, renewable energy targets of 2030. But if you look at the net zero targets till 2070, the requirements ranges between 7 trillion US dollars to 12.1 trillion US dollar. So that's the amount of investment that we are talking about in terms of, there are different studies which have been carried out, there are different scenarios being considered for net zero, and this is the range of investment that is required in the country.
Interesting. And how much is India currently spending to tackle climate change and to develop clean energy solutions? Uh, is it mostly coming from the government, or do we have enough private capital available to pull that in as well?
I would say the renewable energy story in India has been actually led by the private sector. While the technologies were not yet established, but NBFCs played a big role to begin with, the non banking financial corporations. So, but then the progressive policies from the government, I would say policies to accelerated depreciation, feed in tariff, really spur investor confidence. But the big push to the renewable energy sector came when the government introduced, I would say, reverse bid auction. That's when a lot of players got interested. It led to massive deployment, large economies of scales were achieved, the prices started, going down. And since then, the renewable energy has been really been, I would say, deflationary when the prices have over the years just gone down. So that's a positive kind of a development, or support from the government through, I would say, conducive policies, whether accelerated depreciation or feed-in tariff, and then to reverse auction bidding. Now, even the auctions which we are seeing increasingly are supporting. I would say I don't want to call there's no such term now as baseload, but it is kind of moving towards providing more secured supply so that recent tenders are now fixed and dispatchable or flexible and dispatchable renewable energy FDRE tenders or RTC round the clock tenders. So it is providing more consistent source of supply rather than plain vanilla solar or wind, which was variable in nature. So it wasn't supplying or meeting your demand 24 cross 7. But now the new age tenders are kind of meeting that kind of a demand. So that has really kind of spurred the growth in renewable energy deployment. And now private sector banks and financial institutions and even the public sector banks are more confident about these technologies. The risks involved are much less, and that as a result, we are seeing increasing deployment of capital from both public and private banks and financial institutions, both domestically as well as globally. And in the Indian scenario, I would say largely the investments so far have been through domestic sources.
Oftentimes when we talk about climate finance, I have come across these two terms, mitigation and adaptation. And, the way we need to channelize our funds to both these areas. Can you help us explain the difference between them in simple terms, and how is the money that we pool in allocated between mitigation and adaptation efforts? Is there like a clear framework that is available to understand how to distribute the finance that we have?
Okay, first, what is mitigation and what is adaptation? So mitigation is basically, addressing the causes of climate change, whereas adaptation seeks to address the impacts of climate change. So that money which is used after an event has occurred, helping people cope up with the negative externalities of climate change is what adaptation. But mitigation really helps initially to address or reduce, or actions taken to reduce the severity of climate change. So that's what is mitigation. An example of a mitigation measure would be a carbon tax. So if any money which is being kind of developed or channelized for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which can be in the form of putting it, covering more forest areas or it could be deploying more renewable energies, mitigation. Whereas examples of adaptation would mean, if there has been an occurrence of flood, then you are coming up with provisions of like elevated pillars, providing people boats, life jackets, or after that providing them with money to put up their agricultural fields again. So these are some of the examples of adaptation finance. As far as the India or even globally the money is concerned, I would say we saw that in 2021, 2022, the climate finance flows reached almost closer to USD 1.3 trillion, but out of which about 70 to 80% was for climate mitigation and only 20 to 30% is for climate adaptation. So far, that's the kind of, the breakup that we are seeing. So more and more money is being spent on climate mitigation than climate adaptation. Um, if you remember last year, there was a lot of ask from the developing nations about the loss and damage funds, because last year in particular we saw so many incidences across different nations, especially the floods in Pakistan or the heat waves which spread across different countries. Even India, we had massive heat waves even this year. So there was lot of kind of developing nations in particular are more vulnerable to climate change, and they have been impacted the most and in a worst possible way. So there have been asked for a lot of money to be allocated to loss and damage fund. So last year there was an agreement to increase the pool of money for loss and damage. But to be honest, the results on ground has not been, uh, I would say, really to the extent that we would have wanted to see. So it's not very promising. While there have been a lot of announcements for the allocation more for adaptation, but as I said, it's not been very promising. So your other question on whether there is a proper framework, there are a lot of ways in which this funding gets decided, based on the priorities. So last year, the priority was more because of the increasing incidences of natural calamities to put more money on adaptation rather than mitigation. But we have seen it's largely, mitigation that has got the largest chunk of money so far. So there are different priorities, the way the money gets allocated. Mostly it is also aligned with your NDCs, the national development contributions that the different countries have made, and what is the investment requirement for them to be met. So I think there are different ways through which the money gets allocated, and the priorities gets decided under those frameworks to align with NDCs, to balance between mitigation and adaptation, and also the need based allocation. So, developing countries' climate needs are assessed based on their vulnerability to climate change, particularly for adaptation projects. So, out of the pool, while there is more commitment that it should flow to these developed countries or developing or emerging economies, but globally, 70% of the finance is still flowing to the developed world.
Okay. Makes me wonder that certainly there should be some sort of a balance, because I understand developing nations are the most vulnerable one, and we've seen the kind of impact climate change has had. But given that there is a lack of money as it is, and we of course prioritize it to the immediate needs of disaster hit places, I think we certainly need to come up ways to pull in more money so that we can also invest more in developing these technologies and cleaner solutions, so that we can, to some extent or to whatever extent possible, address the climate change impact. And I will, you spoke about the funds, and I'll definitely come to that. I do have a few questions around that. But since we were talking about the taxonomy that has been built. I remember Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in her budget speech also announced the creation of a taxonomy for climate finance to help raise funds for climate action. And while this is a crucial step, it also makes me think about greenwashing, where companies or entities falsely market themselves as environmentally friendly and that remains a growing concern. How do you think having a framework of taxonomy can help mitigate the risk of greenwashing and ensure that the funds that are being raised are genuinely being used for climate action?
Right. So when we say taxonomy, it's basically refers to, standardized regulations and guidelines that inform both companies and investors about impactful investments in environmental conservation and combating the climate crisis. So different countries have come up with different taxonomies. Some call it climate finance taxonomy, some call green taxonomies, and they provide a detailed list of economic activities and corresponding criteria for alignment with climate goals, offering a structured approach to sustainable investment. In the absence of it, you very rightly said it can lead to green washing. So, what a country needs is a more scientific approach. So, we really need studies to be carried out. The science-based targets that can be set up, in helping define matrix for developing standards and guiding investment. Unless that happens, there is likely no way to kind of understand under which heads or different activities the money needs to go, and whether that money is actually, then we talk about monitoring and verification. Once you have the definition, the investments happen, and then you really need to have a strong guidelines or companies or accredited entities for monitoring and verification of whether the funds are actually being put under the same heads. Like countries like China, Malaysia, Sri Lanka have already kind of issued green taxonomies to facilitate, climate sensitive investment. India also has a task force on sustainable finance, which got established in 2021, and they came up with a paper. Um, but then, since then, there was little progress on that. But thankfully, this year, in the budget speech, the finance minister announced, and hopefully, in next few months, India will have its own taxonomy.
Okay, I think that is certainly required given so many cases of greenwashing that we are seeing and uncovering. Coming back to the funds and the responsibility of developed countries to provide financial support to developing nations like India, because we are the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. There has been all these funds and a lot of buzz around these funds like loss and damage fund or even the 100 billion US dollar climate finance goal. What are these funds exactly, and did we actually even receive the money? Because there have been several sort of reports claiming different things. I read one OECD report that stated that the developed nations actually mobilized 115.9 US dollars for developing countries, surpassing the original target of 100 billion US dollars. And many argued that this is still far from enough. And then there was also reports that this money is coming as a loan rather than a grant. And that makes me think that wouldn't that lead to a debt trap for developing countries like us? And we are seeing, countries around us, our neighboring countries, going through similar challenges. So what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, you're right. Climate finance has been a central element of global climate change negotiation since 1992, but it was only in 2009 Copenhagen Accord that for the very first time a value was put. So it was agreed that US dollars 100 billion would be channelized by the developed countries to developing countries by 2020, by the year 2020. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement further reinforced this target and extended it to 2025 because uh, it was not met in 2020, and it prompted developed countries at COP26 to outline a delivery plan for reaching the target. So we were talking about India's requirement, but globally also we need about 4 to 5 trillion US dollars of investments annually to meet the climate change target. And if you look at the amount of investment, we are just talking about 100 billion US dollars. What the developing countries in total needs is around 1 trillion annual investment, and globally we need about 4 to 5 trillion. So it's just a small pot of money. So even that we could not, the developed countries could not channelize. So I think the while in 2022 this promise was met, but somehow if you look at the new targets, or I would say these 100 billion targets were more of a political commitment or out of political negotiation, but not like based on scientific target. So the requirements are huge, and what we are kind of achieved so far is fairly less compared to what we need.
I think even last year at COP28 in Dubai, there was a lot of push for a new climate finance goal. And countries like India, we are demanding more say in how these funds are used and insisting that these funds be given not as loans but as grants. Even all the discussions that came out of New York Climate Week, we saw a huge focus on climate finance. With COP29 around the corner in Baku, do you think we will be able to address all these pressing concerns?
It's difficult, but definitely, India has been talking about initially as part of its, I would say, negotiation. We talked about differentiated responsibilities. Then India has also been very vocal in terms of, um, the developing economies really have to meet their internal economic growth, and that's why they would need more, I would say, international funding to support that they can actually develop a pathway of low carbon economy without hurting their economic growth. So, what we saw, India would definitely put a lot more pressure to improve transparency, to improve, better standards being put in place. But as I said, this 100 billion target is hardly a drop in the ocean, I would say, compared to what the requirements are. So we are hoping a new collective quantified goal for climate finance from 2025 onwards is what we are hearing is on the agenda at COP29, where delegates will possibly make some progress. And because if you see, even last year at COP28, we saw that we really need to now shift the needle. And the kind of finance is what is needed is from not billions, but moving from billions into trillion. So while there is no single number that has been the focus of negotiation, but we are hearing that a largest group of NGOs is what they are asking is 1 trillion US dollars. And that too from public finance from the wealthiest nations in the form of grants and less in the form of loans. So that's also one of the big asks. And as you rightly said, otherwise, if we are getting raising money at markets rate, or because the developing countries have higher risk because of their currency, or in general the sovereign risk, and if the risk, or if the premium is much more from the developed countries to address those risks, the whole purpose gets defeated. And these countries are likely to then fall in the debt trap. So we really need to avoid that. And we have been talking about MDBs or bilateral financial institutions playing a big role. They need to come up with more insurance risk premiums or products which can really help in kind of whether insurance is in the form for foreign currency or blended finance. So these are the kind of, I would say, risk mitigation strategies that needs to come up, and we really need to avoid the developing countries falling into the debt trap.
You spoke about blended finance. Do you think this is like the strongest tool available for us to mitigate the challenges that we are facing around climate finance? Because certainly the governments have a huge role to play when it comes to pooling in the funds. But there is also a role for the corporates to kind of play in this. And while there are risks, ultimately they are running businesses. But what can be done to make sure that there is more private participation coming in from all the sectors, and including the sectors who are also responsible for a lot of fossil fuel pollutions?
As I said, private capital will only put in money when they have assured returns. So, blended finance kind of instruments or government pooling in money or providing, subsidized loans and interest rate subventions can really unlock a lot of private capital. So, we have seen once solar and wind, they became established technologies. Now it's largely private capital that is playing or pumping in big pool of money. So how do we de-risk for nascent technologies, for newer technologies? You really need these kind of instruments. But for established technologies, so depending upon the level of maturity, I would say different financing instruments will have to play a role. For nascent technologies, more public capital, more blended finance instruments, pooling in philanthropic capital, pooling in sovereign wealth capital, pooling in money from government budgets or government banks and financial institutions. Uh, for the initial few projects or for the R&D or for they can really establish um, through pilots. I don't want to even enforce or make a case that pilot studies are the best. They are initially to begin with. Yes, you need some, but then how do you really need to scale up? That becomes important because pilot studies have been carried out a lot in India, but then scaling has been limited. So pooling in these large pools of capital from different sources, as I said, can really unlock private money. And then we talked about, how regulation can play a big role. So having the climate finance taxonomy that really gives a boost to investors' confidence that there is a clear definition in terms of what constitutes green. Uh, so that helps. Then you have a proper ESG disclosures in place. That really again helps corporates, because there is a requirement. India has for the 1,000 listed companies the BRSR requirements. But then are these requirements, I would say, uh, meet the global standards? Probably not. So, how do we kind of make these disclosures interoperable and meet the global standards as well? So, I think that's where currently where SEBI or RBI are approaching towards.
What else? I think we covered some of the major, discussion points on the agenda related to climate finance, and hopefully most discussions are going to be focused on climate finance because that is really the key to unlock everything that we want to do in terms of climate change impact and developing solutions and everything. What else do we have on COP agenda from a climate finance perspective, or anything that is critical for climate finance?
Unfortunately, we have not heard much during this COP or in the run up to COP with a country like Azerbaijan, which is a fossil fuel or oil rich country, making big announcement. Though at the start, it was encouraging to see Azerbaijan kind of announcing a fund where the wealthiest oil and gas nations will put up money, which can then be used for climate finance activities across global north and south. I think that's something I would really would want and expect that it fructifies and lot many more commitments
Certainly.
towards low carbon pathway.
Certainly. I think they definitely have a huge role to play, and we definitely need more investments into cleaner energies and technologies coming in from, that sector. Um, for someone who's listening right now and who doesn't really work in the climate or energy sectors, why should they care about climate finance, and how does it really affect our lives in on a day-to-day basis? Because for regular citizens, they hear about these things, they feel that something is being discussed at COP and these global conferences, but it really comes down to, and that is where the awareness part also plays in, that मुझे क्यों फर्क पड़ना चाहिए, मेरे को क्यों पता होना चाहिए what is climate finance.
I think we are all impacted, so it's that no one is spared. It's a global phenomena. Whether India has contributed or we as an individual has not contributed, but we are all impacted. I think we have seen how heat waves, the temperatures cross 50 degrees this year. So I think that's the biggest example of how the global warming is impacting us on a day-to-day basis. It was totally not livable situation when the temperatures cross, and in some areas in Rajasthan specifically, it became so many deaths
Yeah.
are being reported. So I think that's one. Another was we have been, and especially children and elderly, have been having a lot of respiratory issues because of air pollution. Again, that's also led by climate change and contributors to carbon or greenhouse gas emission. There are various drivers to it, but that's how, on day-to-day basis, we are impacted. We have to spend much more money on our health now, or or if you will see, the amount of respiratory issues have gone up in the recent past, and this is all because of the increase in carbon emissions, air pollutions that we are seeing. So yeah, that's how the day-to-day life is getting impacted.
You rightly said, everything that we are experiencing today, which we think is, our normal life, it's actually not normal life. It's largely an impact of climate change. Is there anything that we can do to push for more climate finance, whether it is questioning our authorities and government or actually paying attention to state budgets, or the union budgets, how much focus is being given to climate change? Are there any examples that some states are doing a better job, we can learn from them, or certain communities are doing a better job at pushing for more such initiatives? Are there something like that which would probably encourage others to also follow?
Definitely, awareness is something now we are seeing increasingly people being more aware. Um, Whether it's questioning some of the decisions from the government, or it is now we are seeing increasingly it is becoming part of the political mandate. So when there was a lot of representation from the youth, we had examples like Gurgaon moms, out on the streets when the air pollution level started hurting the children so much. The schools were for most of the days not operating, or there were leaves announced because it was not possible for children to step out, even for people to go out and work. So that's the level of impact that we have seen, and that really pushed them asking their authorities for cleaner air, for cleaner water, for cleaner, even Stubble burning has become a big political kind of a mandate where a lot of solutions now are being worked out to ensure, the crop residue is not kind of burned, but how do we use that as a biofuel and rather being used as a cleaner form of energy. So these are some of the solutions which have primarily come because people are more aware, they're asking or questioning their authorities. So that's how, as an individual, we have. The other way is also by installing, say, for example, solar rooftop at your place. That's how you, as an individual, can contribute in minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions. There are other ways through which, energy efficiency is another way of, looking at things, not from the supply side, but from the demand side. You are reducing the electricity consumption by deploying more energy efficient appliances. So that's how, at an individual level, you are demanding or deploying solutions at your end. But the government has to play a big role by, say, green public procurement really helps in reducing some of the cost for these energy efficient appliances, or providing a mandate to specific set of consumers, whether it's industries that necessarily they have to start using cleaner forms of energy. So that's how there are mandates coming. The ESG disclosures again pushes corporates to set up more low carbon solutions into their operations. So these are ways and means through which different consumers are responding to adverse impacts of climate change at an individual level, or asking the government to respond to address some of these negative impacts.
Absolutely. And I think we've also had some successes when it comes to certain campaigns. I can recall the LED campaign. That
Yeah,
was a huge success. Most households
absolutely.
today have finally moved on to choosing an LED compared to other sources of lighting. So,
Yeah.
certainly, I
Very
think, yeah.
recently, the PM Suryodaya scheme,
Yes,
to kind of help 1 crore households to deploy solar rooftop will be a game changer again.
absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
another big scheme from the government to push, solar rooftop, and that will really kind of address or using more solar, which is in abundance in most of the cities in India with good intensity. So I think that's the way to go about it.
Definitely. I think, today's discussion was really helpful, and I hope we were able to simplify climate finance to some extent for people, and made it easier for them to understand at least why is it important, and why we need to push governments or corporates to really, sort of help pool in that funds that we need for climate change, addressing climate change. Thank you so much, Vibhuti, for helping us today to understand this complex yet essential topic. And climate finance isn't just a buzzword; it is the backbone of our efforts to fight climate change globally. So, thank you so much. This was really helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful speaking with you, and especially, as I said, on this very topical thing. And thank you for making it like more of a mainstream discussion. So far, it was not something which anybody and everybody understands, but thank you for simplifying it and helping common man to understand.
Often, climate finance feels like it's too little, too late. While there may be disagreements over the amount and how it is delivered, to make real progress, we need to keep having these discussions and push for solutions that ensure a fair and effective distribution of resources. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. If you have any questions or climate related topics you want me to cover, drop me a text in the comments. Until next time, stay informed and keep talking.